First, I want to acknowledge my colleague who could unfortunately not be here today, Carolyn Tolbert at the University of Iowa, and she has worked on a lot of the research that I'm going to discuss today. I want to talk about surveys, the citywide surveys that we've been doing with support from PCI here. And some of this parallels the research in Illinois that John has just talked about. But the data that we've been collecting citywide is also going to go along with a program evaluation. I'll talk a little bit about that too, that I've been working on with support from the Macarthur Foundation, an evaluation of the Smart Communities program. So I want to talk both about that citywide data, but also how that's going to fit with the program evaluation too, because I think we have some unique opportunities combining both of those. So I just want to mention, as a context for some of the data I'm going to be presenting, and this goes along with what John had done. You know, what's important to measure in terms of broadband adoption? Well, I'll be talking about different forms of access, but in the end, what matters is what people do with the technology. So broadband is a public policy issue because it has what's called public goods characteristics. It has spillover benefits for communities and for the nation as a whole. For individuals, it's important as a policy issue because it's necessary today for equality of opportunity, for social inclusion. What my colleague Carolyn and I have called elsewhere digital citizenship, or the ability to participate in society online, again, because so much is moving online. So both of these suggest that what we need to measure is activities online, those activities that broadband enables, and to look at those both for individuals, but also the impact that these activities online, or the absence of them, has for communities. And I mentioned we're doing some program evaluation. In the end, what we care about is not just what people do online, but whether that improves health, whether that improves job opportunities, and so on and so forth, but it's often a lot more difficult to measure in a short term, within a couple years, those impacts. So knowing these intermediate outcomes, what are people doing with the technology, can be really helpful for a deeper evaluation later. So what we've done, the Chicago citywide surveys that we've done, the first one, and that's the data I'll show you today, was conducted in summer of 2011, and we're actually in the field. We started this week, just this week, to do a follow-up survey, which will be up through the end of this year and maybe slightly into January. And so we have data from 2008 from a study that a citywide survey that we did for the city of Chicago. And so we have this unique opportunity with data in 3 years, and we'll be able to look at changes over time. We had in the summer 2011 survey about 3,000 respondents. We'll have maybe just a little less than that this time. And as John's already talked about, the importance of random sampling and cell phone sampling, that was part of this as well, and we conducted the surveys in both English and Spanish. One thing we did, I'm going to talk about neighborhoods. We stratified the sample by neighborhood, by Chicago's community areas. So what we get from that is this really, besides the citywide data, being able to say something about Chicago as a whole, is that we have this unique neighborhood level data. We asked people about, the cross streets where they lived, and we're able to code people for where they live, the characteristics of those neighborhoods, merging in census data on, the race, ethnicity, income for their neighborhood, for their census tract, actually. And then we did something that's called multi-level models. What that means is we're looking at the effects for individuals and the neighborhood, individual characteristics and neighborhood characteristics. What we've done with that, I'll show you maps in a few minutes. You'll see some percentages. It reads like simple percentages, but we're able to estimate things like broadband at home, broadband adoption at home, internet use for work, internet use for health, and so forth. The percent, we're estimating the percent in each community area who that applies to. So we're mapping actual use here and not just availability. I just want to say something about why this kind of neighborhood information is important, we think, for public policy. For example, I'll show you some instances of this. We're able to ask, does it make a difference, the person's neighborhood? If someone lives in a poor community, does that make a difference? There's been a lot said about the double burden of being poor and living in a poor neighborhood. We're actually able to test that and look at some of those effects. Also, you'll see from some of these maps, we can see patterns of how neighborhoods are disadvantaged for economic development, or how there's a lack of health information online in certain neighborhoods. And so that's important information for public policy. Also, again, how do we target resources? What areas, if we have scarce resources, which areas do we target? So what we're doing in this project is also, as I mentioned, bringing together this citywide data from PCI, that PCI has supported, and to bring that together with the Macarthur Smart Communities evaluation. In that evaluation, we're looking at changes for individuals, but we can look at change for the communities that people live in as well, and see whether those neighborhoods where there's programs, whether those areas where there's been a treatment, do those look different from other Chicago communities? So are there benefits for individuals and also for their neighborhoods? I just want to say some of the questions that we included in the survey. The surveys we've done across years have been about forms of internet access. I'm going to look at that a little bit in a minute. We've also asked questions about activities online, about the skills that people have, and barriers to adoption. Okay, so just to look at Chicago and how it compares. Chicago looks a lot like Illinois and the rest of the nation if we're just looking at who uses the internet. 79% use the internet somewhere, and 67% have broadband at home. And that's an increase since 2008, up from 75% who use the internet anywhere and 61% who have broadband at home. What we found for Chicago, and again, it looked a lot like Illinois. Actually, our Chicago survey was done a little earlier, so I think we'll find the numbers have grown a little bit in this 2012 survey. We found about 4% of Chicago residents were smartphone-only internet users. I think that'll look a little different now. We did this about a year before the Illinois one. So it will have grown a little bit, even though that's still going to be a small percentage of the population. But in Chicago, much like the Illinois data and the national data too, that John mentioned, smartphone-only users tend to be African American in particular. They tend somewhat more to be Latinos too. They're young, they're low income, etc. Young, low income, less educated. So I'm going to look at this in some ways a little differently than John did, although there's some overlap. We want to ask whether smartphones are closing the gap in poor neighborhoods. So using these maps, and PCI did the really beautiful maps here, using these maps and looking across Chicago's community areas, on your left is broadband use, broadband at home by community areas. So the places that are in red, and have the lowest rates of broadband adoption at home, and green is the highest, and orange is sort of low, and so forth. So for those of you who are familiar with Chicago, this is basically the geography of poverty in Chicago, that the south and west sides that tend to be poorer in the city are the places with lower broadband adoption, the places that look more red or orange, although there's some variation here. If you look on the right, that's a map of smartphone-only internet users, and again, red means that those places have a low percentage of smartphone-only users. Now, one of the interesting things, if you're asking about whether this is closing the gap in poor neighborhoods, yes, this smartphone-only gap looks more varied than the one on the left that's broadband. There are, in fact, some neighborhoods that are fairly low-income neighborhoods, a few here and there, that light up green. But this is really the exception. So there are some interesting exceptions. I think some of these tend to be areas where there are a lot of college students as well, or where there's been some middle-class development, even though some of these are mostly African-American neighborhoods that light up green. But overall, there's still, these poor neighborhoods that have low broadband access, that have low smartphone use too. So it's not true that it's solving the problem in Chicago, even in terms of access. But, I've mentioned, so I want to look a little bit more at the patterns we found from the models. And these are the multi-level models where we've looked at individual characteristics and neighborhood characteristics. And I want to mention for both broadband and smartphones. So we can see that Latinos especially are the group in Chicago and nationally who are least likely to have broadband at home. Interestingly enough, when we control for neighborhoods, African Americans are as likely to have broadband in Chicago, and this is true nationally too, as non-Hispanic whites are, but that's only when we control for neighborhood. So what that means is there is a gap there, but those are African Americans who live in very poor neighborhoods. So the disparities for African Americans are very much place-based. They're concentrated in very poor neighborhoods. And African Americans, by a huge amount in Chicago, are much more likely to have smartphones than whites. It's really popular here in the African American community. So how does neighborhood matter? I had mentioned that we're able to test this. Although we see, to some extent, and this is that sort of mixed map on smartphones that you've seen, although we see that residents of high poverty neighborhoods, there's some tendency to have smartphones. Residents in neighborhoods with a high percentage of African Americans, a high percentage of Latinos, or older populations, are less likely to have either broadband or smartphones. So this is kind of explaining some of the things that we saw on the map. Why smartphones, have not even really closed the gap in access. So I'm not going to go over this. Actually, this and the next chart, these are both in some material that you were linked to with the invitation for this. It's available to you to look at. Basically, these are the activities online, like John had looked at, somewhat different, for health, for politics, City of Chicago website, looking for work, using the internet on your job. And one interesting thing we found, though, is that smartphone-only users were much more likely than broadband users. The only thing where they were more likely to be online was looking for a job. Now, that doesn't mean only on their smartphone. I know from focus groups that smartphone-only users often use the public library. The way we asked the question was, what do you do on the internet? What this just shows is once we control for other factors like differences in age and education and so forth, that relationship still holds up. So just to sum up why home broadband matters, Chicago residents with home broadband do more online. We looked at measures of skill. They have more skills than smartphone-only or other less connected internet users. Again, even controlling for other factors, smartphone-only users are more likely to look for jobs online, or they're more likely to use social networks or entertainment, but again, not more likely to do most activities.